let's examine the individual incidents that give substance to Brownsville's claim. To begin with, it must be recognized that the Spanish explorer Pineda was knocking on Brownsville's back door in the year 1519, as opposed to the initial establishment of the Villa de Bejar in 1718. 200 years of difference. The first major anchor of historic proportion occurred with the Battle of Palo Alto, which launched the Mexican-American War, a destiny-changing event that altered the landscape for Mexico and the United States in a huge manner. In essence, it brought about profound changes in world politics, 1846 to 1848. And then secondly, Fort Brown is the first military base on the Mexican border, oldest permanent fort in Texas, called Fort Taylor in March of 1846, later renamed in honor of Major Jacob Brown, who died there in the May of 1846. Third point, the oldest purpose-built city hall public market house in Texas. That was Market Square. Fourth point, the next major occurrence in Brownsville that got world attention was when it became ground zero for the back door to the south as a loophole in the Union blockade of the Confederacy. International interests were swarming the streets of Brownsville, and its name was mentioned in all of Europe's capitals and beyond. Fifthly, the last formal battle of the Civil War was fought at Palmito Ranch here, just outside of Brownsville. Sixth claim. First maneuvering to provide military assistance to Mexico for the expulsion of the French insurrectionists at the end of the Civil War occurred at Brownsville, with the building of a pontoon bridge to Matamoros and the stationing of U.S. generals such as U.S. Grant, Philip Sheridan, and others at Fort Brown. A little-known fact outside of military scholars who are familiar with the events that transpired directly after the close of the Civil War. In actuality, this was the first active instance of the enforcement of the hemispheric protection provisions of the Monroe Doctrine. The next period of mobilization of that doctrine did not occur until the Roosevelt administration and the events of the Spanish-American War over Cuba. A contingent of 50,000 U.S. troops was sent to the Mexican border, primarily Fort Brown, by President Andrew Johnson to aid in Mexico's expulsion of the French. The enforcement of the conditions of this doctrine would have been pursued earlier, but the U.S. was engaged in the issues of the American Civil War. Seventh claim. Brownsville became the starting point of the Chisholm Trail, 1867 to 1884, during the era of Reconstruction after the Civil War. There was a need to feed this country with beef, which was abundant throughout Central and South Texas. For the span of the years that the trail drives took place for this project, it is estimated that approximately 5 million head of cattle were led overland, starting with Brownsville to the rail terminals of the Midwest. In the 1930s, a man by the name of P.P. Ackerley promoted a formally designed trail defined by placement of ceremonial roadside markers along the route of the former trail. Ackerley actually took a photograph at Mid-Bridge in Brownsville on the Gateway Bridge, with the sign, "The End of the Chisholm Trail," mounted on his car. Eighth claim. The future president of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz, planned his revolution to invade Mexico and come to power in 1876 in Brownsville. He launched his final and successful rebellion against President Sebastián Lerdo Tejeda from Brownsville, Texas in 1876. He went to New Orleans and then to Brownsville to organize the Plan de Tuxtepec, a rebellion that was supported by local financiers who provided funding for his cause. He crossed into Mexico and, after gaining control of the government, became president. The full scrutiny of the administrative branch of the U.S. government was focused on Brownsville and Diaz's actions that were in violation of international neutrality treaties. Ninth claim. The second international phone call of all times. The phone call that established telephone service across the Mexican border, specifically connecting points including Brownsville, Texas, and Matamoros, Mexico consulates, took place on February 26, 1883. The world's first international telephone call was made on July 1st, 1881, between St. Stephen, New Brunswick, Canada, and Calais, Maine, United States. 10th claim. The Brownsville Affair of 1906. Brownsville was the location of a racially charged incident whereby an entire regiment of black infantrymen stationed at Fort Brown was dishonorably discharged by President Theodore Roosevelt. The ensuing military courts-martial trial was the center of national attention throughout its occurrence. 11th claim. Beginnings of World War I and in the throes of the 1910 Mexican Revolution, Colonel Byron Q. Jones piloted a biplane that became the first U.S. military aircraft to be fired upon, that was 1916, by hostile enemy forces, and that was Pancho Villa's troops. Of significance also during this period of instability that arose from the interior Mexico during the Mexican Revolution was the call out for assistance by residents along the southern U.S. border for military protection against the violence that was a spillover from the warring conditions that were taking place throughout Mexico at the time. A total of approximately 100,000 U.S. troops was sent to the border, with Fort Brown being a primary staging center. The sensationalist media were spreading stories of heinous massacres of U.S. residents by revolutionaries, and conspiracies of German intervention into the events of the war pointed to distinct incidents that occurred right outside of Brownsville, with the Olmedo train robbery of 1915. This was a significant violent event near Brownsville linked to the Plan de San Diego rebellion and potentially influenced by German espionage interests during the Mexican Revolution, the World War I era, aiming to destabilize the U.S. border region. German conspiracies sought to exploit revolutionary interest by arming Mexican factions and fomenting anti-American sentiment to tie down U.S. resources away from the World War I efforts in Europe. 12th claim. The Brownsville Municipal Airport opened in 1929, establishing the first international airmail service by Charles Lindbergh. Brownsville, Texas was the location of a pioneering flight school with Pan American Airways, establishing a school for instrumentation and blind flying here. As a result, Brownsville soon became a pioneer training center for the now highly technical craft of blind flying, or piloting an aircraft by the use of navigation instruments alone. 13th claim. Brownsville was a site of flight tests for a modified B-29 bomber equipped with a jet engine, though not the first flight of the standard piston B-29 which occurred in Seattle. This testing in Brownsville was part of development of jet-powered aircraft and highlights the city's role in significant aviation history. From a military base at Brownsville Airport, the B-29s flew out over the Laguna Madre along the Gulf Coast and incorporated a mechanical setup whereby the experimental jet engine was lowered on a contained framework from the bomb bay and tested for operational development. 14th claim. In the summer of 1958, the eyes of the world settled upon an incident that took place right off the coast of Boca Chica Beach, involving a major raid by U.S. authorities, a Brownsville sheriff, of a group of commandos that sought to transport arms, mercenaries, tens of thousands of dollars in cash and valuables that were destined to launch the Cuban Revolution. Not only were these mercenaries detained in Brownsville jail, but an extremely high-level political operative of the Bautista regime was sent from Miami directly to Brownsville as the flight of exiles took place post-revolution under CIA guardianship. Incidentally, and apart from the other issues that I have just mentioned of historical importance worldwide, consider also Dr. William Gorgas, physician, sanitary engineer, President of the American Medical Association, and Surgeon General for the U.S. Army, performed some of the early and conclusive research into the origins of yellow fever at Fort Brown. This is about the time of the development of the Panama Canal. Do you see the depth of Brownsville's claims for historic significance? Each incident had implications on a serious national or international scale. They weren't merely marketing ploys that were devised to generate tourism or make curious entries in the Believe It or Not columns. I just went through 14 points of what could really be considered major issues with world affairs and international politics, the whole gamut. Can you see there how Brownsville truly deserves a more in-depth investigation in the claim as the most historic city in Texas? For the next chapter, Brownsville to Mars, history-making endeavors. It has already been registered that SpaceX launched the largest, heaviest rocket in the history of aerospace engineering from its starbase near Brownsville, Texas. And there you have it. And the rest is history.